I really appreciate you coming out this evening. We're very happy to. I'm very happy to welcome Chris Lawton, one of our seminarians, who's also a doctor, and he'll talk a little bit more about that. He's a dear friend from New York City, so I'm really glad that he's able to make this. Fresh from finals, he had finals last week in theology and scripture, and took a plane, and here he is. Shifting gears, and preached this last weekend, and we're keeping him busy, so that we're very excited to have him. I wanted to say a word of great thanks to the Preglers, who are providing all the drinks tonight, and a lot of Christmas cheer. So there's plenty. Thank you. We're so grateful, and they have plenty. So make sure that you are cheered up appropriately. and also our other seminarian. We're so blessed to have seminarians here at St. Paul's. Chris he does all our receptions now. Hey, Chris, we need a reception. He puts it together. So thank you, Chris, for your help. Welcome. I hope we have just a conversation. He's going to give a presentation, and we'll have some questions and talk about these both amazing vocations that God has given us. So welcome, Christopher Lawton. Thanks, thank
you. Thanks, Father Gil, and it really is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Father Gil, I know well enough to know that he wouldn't want me to spend a lot of time, loving on him publicly. But I will say that, he talks about friendship. I will share with you tonight some thoughts about my own vocation story and my story of coming to be with you all here tonight, and to finding some overlap between these amazing fields, as Father Gil said, of ministry and medicine, is in no small thanks to him and our friendship and his mentorship. So I'm so grateful for the invitation of a dear friend. I'm really also so grateful to meet and get to know the St. Paul's community more. I've made a few visits here. Once for just a brief time, was in the area for a ministry thing, and then another time for some social things. But I was really excited to be here yesterday and to be here tonight. So thank you so much. And it's wonderful to see my seminary brother Chris as well. So this is a treat, because Chris is on his year here with all of you, so we don't have him in Washington. So it's really fun to be with him. I would like to start tonight by telling you that I would like to dedicate my thoughts tonight to my dear friend, Dr. Megan Jessamine. Dr. Jessamine was, as I will share a little bit later in our presentation, a really, really close friend of mine in medical school. And after completing training to be a psychiatrist, just a few short years after we graduated, she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And just this past summer died of that really, really tragic illness. And so she is someone, as I will share tonight, that helped me think more about the intersection between areas of medicine and what it means to be alive, and the spiritual and religious dimensions of that. And so thinking about this interplay and this overlay for me is a chance to really honor her. So tonight is really about her. I would like to frame our conversation about faith and medicine around some stories. Yesterday, we were talking in the gospel about the way that this angel comes to Saint Joseph and helps him see his entire reality in a new way. And my own coming to first be a physician and now coming into ministry and discerning priesthood is really the story for me of coming to know people who have had the same kind of transformative impact on my life. And I'm going to share a little bit about my own journey, but I'm mostly going to tell you some stories. And for me, sharing something of my own story is, I hope, an opportunity for all of us to reflect on our own, especially as we're coming to the end of this year and especially as we're getting ready for Christmas. So please hear what I'm saying tonight as an opportunity for reflection. And as Father Gil said, time at the end for some questions and hopefully some discussion. There is perhaps no more infamous part to the beginning of any journey in medical school than entering the anatomy lab. when you move into medical school, in my case, a first-year dorm, you buy all the textbooks and you sign up for all the classes and you sort of scarily meet all of your medical school colleagues. And as much as you get involved in the rhythm and get going, as probably many of you in healthcare remember, whether it's in nursing or doctoring or whatever field you studied, you had this opportunity, there is this daunting anticipation of entering the anatomy lab. For us, we were randomly assigned into groups of 6 students, and we went into this large room that's not so dissimilar to the room that we're in now, all lined with these cadaver tables. And in the beginning of this first semester of medical school, you meet this deceased individual with whom this group of people has what for most people would be the most intimate encounter with the human body possible by going through this process of dissection. I had not anticipated one dimension of entering the anatomy lab. As we got going, and we would be there multiple times a week, and we would, as some of you probably remember, go through part by part of the body, going through Gray's Anatomy textbook and identifying all of the structures. While you're doing all this work, you start to have conversations with your classmates, sometimes about medicine, but sometimes about what else is going on, because some of the work does require an immense amount of time. And over the course of my first few classes, I heard people saying, "Have you heard about this priest that lives in our dorm?" And I was like, "No, I haven't. I didn't know there was a priest living in our first year med school dorm." And there are people, "Yeah, there's this priest. I saw him on the elevator." Now, no offense to Columbia University, that's where I was in medical school, but I thought it was a little ironic that a school that was founded in the mid-18th century by King George II, no longer espousing any religious affiliation, would have a priest living in the top of the first year medical student dormitory. But sure enough, a few weeks later, I met Father Daniel Morrissey waiting for the elevator just as I was. He had worked in various roles around the university for a number of years. He'd sat on the ethics committee. He'd been involved in state medical boards around the country. And in a semi-retired state, he'd gotten this gig working as a counselor and mentor for medical students and other healthcare professionals. At Columbia, we had the School of Public Health, School of Nursing, and other forms of therapy right there in Washington Heights with us. And Father Morrissey had this penthouse apartment perched right in the middle of all of it. And among the things that Father Morrissey would do is he would come and visit us in the anatomy lab. Now, while we had other instructors there to make sure that we got our dissections right, or to make sure that we were on the right page of the textbook, or helping us prepare for the next exam, Father Morrissey was there without any specific agenda. He was there to help us hold space for the non-practical parts of being in anatomy. The way that standing before this body might make us reflect on our own mortality. The way it might trigger a memory of a loved one that we had lost, or maybe just left us in wonder and awe at the complexity of the human organism and the great mystery of being alive at all, how it all works together. There was this way that science was directing us towards a mystery that science couldn't explain fully. Father Morrissey knew that someone needed to be present for that. So we became pretty good friends. Over the course of my first and then subsequent years of medical school, we would have long chats in his apartment, and we would have meals out, and we would talk about all kinds of things, not the least of which was both having grown up in Milwaukee. But Father Morrissey was teaching all of us that an important part of our work in medicine would be just showing up and just being present. And he would teach us that the word just probably doesn't belong in that sentence at all. That there's something about presence itself which would be one of the hardest things for us to give. Us type A personalities who are looking to give medication and therapy and check off the long list of boxes that you check off as a medical intern to show that you've done all the things that you hoped to do on a given day. One of the hardest things to do would be to hold space for people who were facing the mystery of great suffering. Really being present to the mystery of living and dying would be one of the hardest lessons to learn, and it would be one of the lessons that I would continue to learn as I made my way into seminary. In seminary, we have a term for this idea of being fully present. We call it the ministry of presence. The ministry of a presence is a skill that we actually get taught, or we actually talk about, which is this dimension of showing up without an agenda. Showing up in the way that perhaps great ministers, great mentors in your life have. Showing up and knowing that something is going to happen sometimes because we get out of the way of our own needs and our own agenda. Showing up for one another being an important part of the ministry of Jesus. Father Morrissey helped us hold something of the mystery of living and dying. And as we begin tonight, I'd just like to say that this week is perhaps no better week than to do the same thing. We all stood over an anatomy lab table, but the entire celebration of this upcoming week is to stand over the greatest sense of the human body, the greatest incarnation experience of all time, which is the person of Jesus. And just like all of us, hold space for the mystery of what is happening. That God so loves this amazing life form that is human beings and loves the story of each of us that God becomes one, God's self. Perhaps the experience of Christmas is simply doing what Father Morrissey did and modeled for all of us. Just hold space for this great mystery. For me, holding that space is an invaluable part of the connection between the worlds of medicine and faith. There was, in addition to anatomy lab, a lot of classroom study. Those of you that have been in the healthcare professions know that you spend not only time in anatomy lab, but the expectation, no matter what area of medicine you're going into, is that you have a sense of the breadth of all dimensions of health as it relates to the human body. The only way I got through medical school was, first of all, through some amazing friends. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, my dear friend Megan was my closest in medical school. Megan entered medical school in her early 40s. She was the oldest student in our class of just under 200. She had already earned a PhD in philosophy and education, and she was a mom. After a lot of discernment, Megan felt that the best way she could use all the training and gifts that she'd been given was to study and eventually practice as a psychiatrist. And with the blessing of her then adolescent daughter and some family and close friends, she entered a post-baccalaureate program and then medical school with all of us. Megan and I used to like to joke that among our medical school colleagues, we were on what we called the slow train. We would work really hard just to get the average score on any exam that we took. We had lots of friends who could just see and read something, and maybe you've all had these friends too, and they've just got it. Megan and I were not those people. And so we would sit next to each other in class, and we would furiously take notes. And then we'd stay up late at night, usually in her Park Avenue apartment. I had never been to Park Avenue before. And we would study with flashcards, and we would sit up quizzing each other. And over that time, we also had a lot of wonderful experiences talking about life and family, and all the things that led us to this wild experience of medical school. One of the things that would happen in class is that when we didn't understand a concept, we would always sit next to each other so that we could make sure that if one person missed it, the other person got it. So I really appreciated that sometimes, in addition to the very practical parts of learning the human body, Megan would sometimes throw in interesting thoughts she had from her other experience, usually in the humanities, about medicine and life itself. She loved, and she was constantly seeing the connection between all dimensions of life. And for her, there was this way that being alive was like this amazing unified narrative that was unfolding, and which, if she just kept studying long enough and pursuing different degrees, she was eventually going to be able to put this whole narrative together. And we could laugh about the fact that this was all at once an incredible ride and also probably a fool's errand. One of our first-year medical school courses was in embryology, where you study the development of the human body as it happens inside the womb. All of our students in our first-year program had to take this course, and on one particular day, we were studying the development of the human hand. It turns out, in embryology, you learn that in order for our hands and feet to develop, and there's an image of a developing hand on the screen behind me, these web structures form. And then in order for us to have digits and toes, the cells between what looks like a duck's webbed feet actually have to die in order for digits to form in the way that we see them in the human hand. So I'm writing all this down and getting all my notes in order about the differentiation, as it's called, that happens to create a hand. And Megan leans over to me and she goes, "Oh, do you know what this means?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh, this means that all life requires death." She sat with me in the middle of this lecture, and she told me that all life requires death. That's what she had taken from this otherwise uneventful, unremarkable moment in our embryology course. I was in the middle of a rat race of note-taking and the competition that happens in medical school, and Megan is reflecting on this amazing and existential reality manifested by the human hand, memorialized in our embryology course. The longer I've studied and practiced medicine, even though it has not been for nearly as long as I'm sure some of you have, one reality has certainly become apparent to me. On a very fundamental level, no one knows, like healthcare workers do, all of the kinds of dying that are involved in this business of living. Illness and suffering, caring for people who are experiencing it, forces anyone in healthcare to confront dying in all kinds of ways. People who go through illness and suffering, of course, whether you know it professionally or personally, are constantly dying from either one way of living or the expectation of what life might have actually looked like, or what they hoped it would look like, and discovering something new about how they're going to carry on. Even people cured of illness go through what we might call the parabola of living, dying to some expectation of what was going to happen, or some way things used to be, and carrying on in some new way. The pattern of dying and rising pervades physical, mental, and spiritual health. The entire model of, to give one example, Alcoholics Anonymous, for anyone that's familiar with it, is based on this model. This model that there's some kind of dying to the power that I have or perceived that I had in the world and giving over to some other kind of authority. One very successful model, I might add. And for anyone practicing medicine, we're probably used to the little dyings that have to happen to us all the time. For healthcare workers, the dying of my need for control every part of my day. The dying when you're in the midst of a crazy day in clinic and you had an expectation of how it was all going to fit together. Perhaps, and this certainly happened for us young bucks in medical school, is dying to our own ego. One of my favorite spiritual writers and thinkers is Father Richard Rohr, and Father Rohr says that it's good for us all to have one good embarrassment a day. Father Rohr says that an embarrassment is great because it constantly reminds us of our need for our own humility and our acceptance of our own limitations. And an embarrassment, as I've experienced a lot of in medical school and training and then doctoring, whether it's not having the right answer on rounds, getting a diagnosis wrong, or learning from someone very unexpected in the midst of your day, a lesson that you really needed to learn. Sometimes a good embarrassment is just what is needed, and it can happen a lot to us in healthcare. Megan had a loose connection, I would say, with Christian faith and a Christian church, but I think she very much intended in the middle of our medical school day to say something about a truth that is, of course, at the heart of our Christian faith. We who are a part of the Christian family hold in the deepest part of ourselves that dying and rising to new life is the very essence of our existence, manifested perfectly by Jesus, who gives us the very access through his own dying to life in God, which we only get glimpses of right now. At the heart of our faith, of course, is the reality that all life and eternal life requires death. And in my years working in hospice and palliative medicine, so many people near the end of their lives, for me, were witnesses to that glimpse of some new life that is far beyond this side of heaven. It was undeniable that amidst immense suffering, there would be an enduring hope, ability to make meaning, and sometimes even joy that people found in extraordinary circumstances, that as a person of faith, I could only ascribe to some glimpse of new life to which I only understand in the smallest way right now. All life requires death. Megan and I, and all of our colleagues, eventually made it through medical school. And after medical school, as some of you know, we go on to medical residency, where in my own case, I decided, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do long term, I would study internal medicine or learn about the host of organ-based illnesses that affect many adult patients. I had been doing training largely in a hospital setting, learning about illnesses like high blood pressure, diabetes, COPD. But as part of my training, all residents were required 1 day a week to go and work in a clinic, seeing patients in the outpatient setting like most of us do when we go to the doctor. My clinic was in Washington Heights. Washington Heights in northern Manhattan, made very famous recently in the movie In the Heights. I worked in a busy clinic that was predominantly serving an immigrant and first-generation community of folks from the Dominican Republic. I really loved this clinic. I found it very busy and bustling and high energy, and the people, both patients and staff, were wonderful. It was quite hectic. And I often found myself rushing up to clinic on the 1 train in Manhattan, if you're familiar with it, flying around to see my patients as fast as I could to get it all done, ordering labs, doing the paperwork, and occasionally, with the other great staff there, navigating the crises that would come up when someone came to the clinic when they really should be in the emergency room. During my 3 years in clinic, I became very close with some of our staff. And in particular, I became close with a medical assistant named Maria. Maria was a veteran staff member at our clinic. She helped do blood pressure checks, check people in, and get all the information we needed to begin a visit logged into the computer. She was very warm and very bubbly, and she always had these wise words of wisdom for us residents who she saw running around like mad people in the middle of our day. Over the course of our time together, Maria and I would talk about our shared Catholic faith. She wore a cross across her scrubs and a medal of the Virgin Mary as well. I should have known that I should pay attention to Maria because I learned pretty quickly that she had a son who had recently become a priest whose name was Christopher. I really needed to be paying attention. As I came to know Maria, I found myself confiding in her more and more in some of the difficulties of my life, particularly how I found that amidst the stress and work of medicine, it was very hard to find time sometimes for my spiritual life and for prayer. I would tell Maria how stressed out I was about all the work that there was to do and how I didn't always feel so connected to God. And she would listen to me and she would tell me about her own experiences. But one day, I think she was just pretty fed up with me. And she said, "You know, Chris, I think what you need is 3 Hail Marys a day." And she said, 3 Hail Marys a day, just tell the Blessed Mother with 3 Hail Marys. Now, I was pretty struck by the simplicity of this. I'm very familiar with the Hail Mary. I will admit I wasn't praying it a lot at the time. But Maria was saying that when you don't have the words, or when it's hard to find them or the time to say them, just make a little bit of space and call on the Blessed Mother for help. Now, I've done this exercise for a number of years now, and it turns out that it takes well under a minute to say 3 Hail Marys. That includes the sign of the cross at the beginning and the end. So it was hard to deny that I had time, even as a resident, at least for this. I have so much respect for how difficult it is for folks in healthcare to navigate time. I was just a lowly medical resident. I was living in Manhattan with just a couple roommates. All I had to do was get to work, eat, and sleep, and occasionally read up on various illnesses that the patients I was treating had. Many folks here and many folks that we know have been doing this for years, and in addition, navigate things like massive other commitments, not the least of which is family life and raising children. But the practical limits and the emotional toll of doing this work, no matter where you are in healthcare, surely can place a strain on our lives as spiritual beings and people of faith. And sometimes it is hard to feel connected and stay connected. But Maria taught me, with her notion of 3 Hail Marys a day, that God is not keeping score. God isn't keeping score in the sense of how much did I check in or did I fill every requirement that I had set for myself, just how good a Catholic I was going to be that day. What I was really called to do is open up a little bit of space for God. And as Maria's good counsel noted, perhaps ask the Blessed Mother to lead me there. Maria was saying basically, all you really have to say is, okay, Mary, pray for me, because I just want God to know the best I can do is say, I'm here and I'm trying to be open. I'd like to take 3 Hail Marys as a bit of a metaphor as well. Maybe the Hail Mary is a particularly meaningful prayer for you. It certainly has become so for me. But I think the notion of 3 Hail Marys a day could also be an invitation to use whatever small space you can open up in your own life. German theologian Meister Eckhart once said, if the only prayer you say in your entire life is thank you, that will be enough. And I hold that very, very closely. And whether it's the Hail Mary or the Our Father or thank you or perhaps just a moment of silence, I think many people in healthcare deserve to give themselves a break to say that if we open up just a little bit of space, it's amazing how much God can do with that and how much can grow from there. And so between patients and blood draws and car trips, or maybe just waking up in the morning, somehow we can hold space for whatever version of 3 Hail Marys is right for us. In medical school and in residency, I became aware of a new and rising field of medicine called palliative care. Palliative care is a field that developed in the late 80s and 90s that seeks to ensure that while we're doing and have the ability to do amazing things to extend life in ways that even 100 years ago we couldn't have dreamed possible, we never lose sight of making sure we're doing everything we can to maximize the quality of life for people living with serious illnesses. And palliative care is a field that works through a host of advanced communication techniques and symptom management therapies to make sure that people are living as well as possible while we're ensuring that people can live as long as possible. In my work in the ICU and in clinic, helping patients and families amidst various challenges, I found that the work of palliative medicine, even before I was doing the work explicitly, was very meaningful to me. And I thought it was very meaningful, as I've learned more about healthcare in our country, to be a part of what is really a culture shift to focus on quality of life in tandem with quantity. I started a fellowship in palliative medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, and it was there that I had the opportunity to work with a number of individuals who had been very influential in the founding of our field. And among them is the woman behind me, Dr. Diane Meyer. Dr. Meyer is a geriatrician turned palliative care specialist before you could train as one. And she has helped our country and actually the globe, along with a host of other colleagues, embrace this approach and now this field of medicine. In the years before I was a trainee in her program, she helped advocate for guidelines and training programs and curricula that would allow us to scale up as a country this approach and now this field of medicine that has these important ends. Dr. Meyer gave us a number of lectures during my fellowship, and she shared a lot about the history of palliative medicine and hospice care. Hospice care for those who, as insurance defines it, have, as we would expect, less than 6 months to live, and making sure that they have as high a quality of life and a comfortable as death as possible is an important part of palliative medicine. And one day, Dr. Meyer was talking to us about the birth of hospice in our country. And she said something that I will never forget. She said, you really can't talk about the rise of hospice care and many dimensions of healthcare in this country without talking about the Catholic Church, and specifically women religious in the Catholic Church. You can't talk about the rise of hospice care in our country without talking about the Catholic Church and women religious in the Catholic Church. Now, Dr. Meyer is not Catholic, and Mount Sinai Hospital has always been a sectarian hospital established by local Jewish leaders years ago. So there was no obvious reason for Dr. Meyer to be throwing a plug or endorsement to the Catholic Church for all of us trainees who came from many different backgrounds. But tonight, as we're talking about some of the very real connections that exist between medicine and faith, we have to say that the connection between church and healthcare is not only thematic, it's not only exists on the level of some themes for this talk, it's very practical. To be a nurse or a medical assistant or a doctor or an occupational therapist is to be part of the rich history of the life of the Catholic Church. Some of you may work in a hospital that is or was part of a Catholic hospital or Catholic health system, where there may be some ongoing memory or even still some religious sisters who have had an influence on that hospital or nursing facility or hospice center, to name just a few. And so anyone participating in healthcare in our country is participating in a system, in a dimension that the Catholic Church, particularly women, have had such a massive influence. And this is amazing and rich history for us, right? Because being Catholic and being in healthcare should make sense to us. Doing the work of medicine is in fact right out of the gospel. I would like to be so bold as to adapt Dr. Meyer's words a little bit and to say that you can't talk about the history of faith as a Catholic, as a Christian, without talking about healthcare. The Gospels are filled with the stories of Jesus, who we sometimes call the divine physician, healing physically and emotionally and spiritually. And we enshrine dimensions of healthcare in the corporal works of mercy, one of which is visiting and tending to the sick. Healthcare, in a very profound way, is literally living the gospel. I think Pope Francis honors this in a very profound way. And the image that you see on the screen behind me is an image from when Pope Francis made his visit to the United States back in 2015. He made a visit to the National Shrine just down the road from our seminary, and spontaneously also made a visit to the Little Sisters of the Poor, who work and serve a community just across the road from the shrine. And he went and visited them, as he's doing here. This is a photo from their chapel. He honored the fact that they're a part of this rich history, and they're doing this work that is literally the gospel. So to be a healthcare provider, in a very real way, is to minister in this amazing way already as a human family. It's a way of saying minister and healthcare provider are in so many ways, in so many powerful ways, overlapping. When I was finishing my fellowship and took my first job, I had, in no small thanks to our Paulist parish in New York City, started to think about whether all these themes that I'm speaking to tonight and the spiritual stirrings that they brought up in me might be leading me to consider the priesthood. And so, as I was beginning this work, I decided to get some more space, and I took my first job away from New York City. I was working as an attending in palliative medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin in my hometown of Milwaukee. And I was seeing patients and teaching residents and medical students, but I had begun to speak with, somewhat regularly, our vocations director at the time, whose name is Father Dot. Father Dot served here at St. Paul's a number of years ago. And when I met Father Dot and when I would talk to him over the phone, we would talk about all kinds of things. And I would ask him all kinds of questions that I had. And I kind of approached vocation or the idea of seminary early on, kind of the way you do when you're like exploring job options or you're like applying to like different programs. I just wanted to like gather as much data as possible. And I had like endless questions that I was asking. I wanted to know how long certain things would take and what the expectations were and what the contingencies would be if one thing happened or another. In a wonderfully honest moment, after many, many hours listening to my questions and conversing about the prospect of seminary, Father Dot told me, you know, Chris, I hear you mapping everything out. But in fact, all you really have to do is make one decision, which is, do you want to take a year and consider this thing of priesthood? The beginning of seminary is a year-long retreat. We call the novitiate, where you're really just there to learn about what this is all about. They haven't accepted you yet for anything beyond that year, and you haven't committed to any more than that year. And even though I had the whole thing, or tried to map the whole thing out in my head, Father Dot said, you know, you're really called to just make one decision at a time. No one chooses themselves to be a priest. That isn't our theology or understanding. We understand it to be a calling and something that you're chosen for. Those of us in healthcare are strangers to being confronted likewise with large and complex questions and problems. Patients come to us with a whole host of issues, medical and not medical related, but all of which play into what is placed before us. And in work days that are filled with many, many tasks, it can be difficult to parse out what is the next step to take. I found at times the work of medicine could be very, very overwhelming because it would lead to an endless series of questions about the way things could develop or what could happen that could leave you paralyzed by questions before you could make a decision. But even as healthcare providers, sometimes the calling is to just take the next step. One of the hardest things for me to learn was that it is also there, one decision at a time. I want in healthcare the security of mapping out all the data before I make the decision, because then I'll know I'm making the right one for a patient and their family. But those of you in healthcare know, some of you from years of experience far more than I have, that we never make decisions with all the data. And we're always doing the best we can amidst the messiness that is health, sometimes the messiness that is life if you're exposed to the work of ministry. So much of our lives lies beyond knowing, and all we can do is take one step. For me, an important work of my spiritual life in an ongoing way in ministry is realizing all you're really called to do is take one step at a time. Pope Francis puts it this way. He says, faith is not a light which scatters all our darkness. It's a lamp that guides our steps in the night and suffices for the journey. To those who suffer, God does not provide arguments which explain everything. Rather, his response is that of an accompanying presence, a history of goodness which touches every story of suffering and opens up a ray of light. One step at a time. Within a few weeks of this conversation with Father Dot, I did apply to seminary, and after a few months found out that I'd been accepted. It turns out that when you start telling people that you're going to enter seminary, you get all kinds of different reactions. Some people say really wonderful things like, oh, I can totally see that. That makes sense to me. Other people start asking you about why you're doing that, or ask you questions about the church, or start telling you what they think about the Catholic Church. I got all kinds of reactions about entering seminary. Some really wonderful family and friends were very affirming. My dad, who's a good read on people, said, "I knew something was up." My mom, from whom I can credit my own tendency towards anxiety, looked at me with fear, and I'm not kidding. Her first question was, "Do they even have health insurance?" I love my mother, and she is one of the most supportive individuals in my life for this journey. But one of the most stunning reactions I got was from a colleague of mine at the hospital. I sent this email to everyone I worked with over those years in Milwaukee, explaining what had happened and why in 6 months' time I would be leaving my job. And I was surprised when a colleague of mine, and for her confidentiality, we'll call her Beth, when Beth, who was a highly respected clinician at our medical center, emailed me back and asked if she could come and see me in my office. We didn't know each other very well, except in a very professional sphere. We had worked together in the care of some patients, but I knew her to be very respected, but I did not know her personally. So within a couple hours, she's in my office and she sits down and she starts telling me a little bit about her own experience growing up Catholic, how important her faith was to her and how much it meant to her that I would share this dimension of my life with the community. She told me something then that I will never forget as truly the most unprecedented of reactions to my own news about seminary. After sharing a little bit about her faith, she paused and she said, "You know, ever since I was really young, I've always felt called to be a priest." So I sat there and I just took that in. And she went on to say a little bit more about how important her faith was to her and how much it impacted her work in healthcare and how much healthcare helped her understand something awesome and beautiful about the experience of being alive. In the years since our conversation, I have never forgotten those words. "I've always felt called to be a priest," she told me. I've come back to this conversation more times than I can tell you. And telling you about it today, I acknowledge that there is a lot wrapped up in her words. But what I want to share with you tonight is first to say how much I respect her journey and how much I respect is wrapped up in those few words. But what it's brought me to reflect on, especially for the purposes of our conversation tonight, is that pursuing this work of ministry is an immense, immense privilege. Hearing her feelings, her story, for me was an invitation to consider just what an immense privilege it is to do work that is meaningful, much less choose two dimensions of it, as I have in my life. It's always a privilege to do something and to do work that is meaningful. And it's no secret to any of you that not everyone in our lives and in the world has the opportunity to do work from which they may derive the same kind of interpersonal experience and meaning from it that all of us get to experience. I think that there is an immense privilege in being in seminary and, God willing, one day priesthood, because there is something shared about what happens in healthcare as well. This business of being with people in this really, really profound way. It's a privilege to get the training that we do in healthcare. It's a privilege to appreciate the complexities of the working of the human body and mind. And ultimately, to encounter patients and families in the way that we do is such a privilege. And I consider this business that I'm partaking in right now one as well. And I'm very aware that it's one that, whatever people think of it, is not available to everyone at this moment. And so I just want to hold in her honor that I don't take that lightly at all. And all of us in healthcare and ministry should be grateful for the opportunity to do the work. This is the last story I'm going to tell you. In the years since I've been in seminary, I've stayed in touch with a couple colleagues. Dr. G is one of them. Dr. G worked in a community hospital in New York, and I got to know her during my years in training. She's a lively and energetic person, beloved by patients and staff. And when I first met her, I met her walking into hospital wards, usually wearing very vibrant dresses, outfits, walking in, greeting people, saying hello, very bubbly, smiling to strangers, and generally spreading cheer. One of the lessons she taught us trainees was this. She would say to us, "You must always wear color." She meant it. She told us that it was important to wear colorful clothes, vibrant, bright colors that would light up even the most drab of hospital rooms. She taught us to wear color because she said bringing color into a room automatically changed the environment. It brought people joy. It was a conversation starter, especially with older adults, the focus of her care. It was a way to make a connection. In communicating with Dr. G just a couple years ago, we were in the worst of the pandemic, and we stayed in touch as we were coming out of it, and she shared with me how difficult it was for her to continue her practice. Because as all of us know, during the pandemic, and she cared for many patients with COVID, there was an immense amount of gowning and masking that had to happen. And so people that were in healthcare settings, while they could be there, they could only be there for a limited time. And there were many barriers that offset what was otherwise a very human connection. She lamented that in her work, she found herself and colleagues to be barely recognizable to patients and families as a person, much less as a physician. She worried about the isolation that patients experienced. And so she said, while she couldn't do nearly as much color, she still had her shoes. Even with all the gear on, she would wear these very colorful shoes. This is a picture she sent me of all of her shoes. She laid them out after some email exchanges that we were having. She laid them out in her living room. And she said that this was one way she was fighting back against COVID. She thought it was cool because she did this, didn't expect it to turn out this way, but she said when she laid all her shoes out together, she thought it looked kind of like the coronavirus. And so it was her way of fighting back with color. Shoes were her way of showing the person behind the mask. And even through COVID, she kept wearing color. I don't think Dr. G actually expected that all of us were going to wear vibrant colors every day of our practice. But I do think that what she intended was that you should bring all of yourself to this work, all of your color, all of your personality, everything that makes you you, you should bring to this business of providing care to people. All of us have had the experience, perhaps, of being with great healthcare providers and not so great healthcare providers. I know for me, something that defines a great therapist, nurse, medical assistant, or physician is someone who I can tell is bringing their authentic humanity to the work. Sometimes it's their humor. Sometimes it is a great sense of style. Sometimes it's their sarcasm. Sometimes it's their ability to hold empathy and sympathy in a way that is truly extraordinary. Healthcare is a vocation. And like any vocation, it requires that we bring every part of ourselves. God doesn't expect that we check part of ourselves, our authentic and honest selves at the door so that we can go and do something for which we're basically a machine during the day, and then we come back at night and act as our normal selves. No, this actually involves all of our talents if we're doing it well. Sometimes the word vocation gets used exclusively in the realm of seminary formation or religious sisters and priests. But in fact, we all have one. And the work of ministry and the work of healthcare and any true vocation is done because it's done well when we bring color. One of the things that I'm learning and that we learn in formation for the priesthood is that you aren't supposed to become a priest to be a sacrament machine. And those of us that are going into priesthood, as I'm told, because we think, well, I'm just going to get up there and go through the motions of celebrating the Eucharist or anointing someone. If we're doing it as a bot And if you've ever experienced, and I will say I have had the experience of being with priests who just felt like robots, something is missing. And the same I know is true in the care of patients and families. Any true vocation does ask all of us. And so no matter what your color is, I hope all of us can do our best. And I'm certainly going to continue to try to bring all of our color to our work. That's what Dr. G was trying to convey. I think it's part of the work that all of us have to do. So over the years, people ask me about why switch from hospital to seminary and how is it all going to fit together? I would say that I came into religious life in the Paulist because I found that at St. Paul's in New York and now in seminary life, there's a time and a space to explore some of the spiritual and existential questions that healthcare raised for me. I truly, truly love the work of medicine and the work of palliative medicine. And if for some reason, I don't have an expectation of this, but if for some reason this crazy ride that I'm on didn't work out, I suspect that I would go back to that work. Sometimes people ask, well, how is it all going to fit together? Are you going to go to clinic a couple days a week and then be a priest on the weekends? And I've tried to give over having a sense of how it all fits together. Because as I hope you've heard tonight, part of this is about giving over control and giving over certainty about what's lying ahead. But I do know this much. I do know that there are these amazing stories that keep coming up and keep teaching me important lessons. And I know that there's an immense amount of intersection between these two amazing realms of vocation. And what I'd like to do is to keep exploring these intersections. And I'm grateful for the chance to share a couple stories tonight, stories that are forming my own story. As I said at the beginning, I think every time we tell our story, it's an opportunity and an invitation for other people to reflect on theirs. And so I just want to say, first of all, thank you for offering me the space to do that. And I hope it's been valuable. And most of all, I want to say thank you for participating in whatever vocation is yours. For many of us tonight, healthcare is an important part of that. And I just have, especially in the time that we're living, such a reverence for all the ways that people give their God-given gifts to that work. So I want to say thank you and appreciate your being here.
But thank you so much for being here tonight. I want to thank Janet and John. John is handling the bar over there, so he'll take care of you. But there's plenty of food, and we'd love for you to just mingle and have conversation. Thank you so much for coming out. We are celebrating the great season of Christmas, which is all about color in so many ways. So Merry Christmas, and thank you very, very much. Chris.
All right.